Today, we're so happy to have Dr. John Woodall, and he will be talking about his reflections on the Baha'i long healing prayer. Dr. Woodall is a psychiatrist, formerly on the faculty of Harvard Medical School with special expertise in post-traumatic stress disorder, resilience, and treatment-resistant depression. He was director of the State Department refugee relief effort in the Balkans after the war there, and the convener of the Resilient Responses to Social Crisis Working Group at Harvard University. At the request of the mayor's office of New York City, he developed and implemented a citywide resilience building program for children after 9/11 that was also implemented in New Orleans and Mississippi after Hurricane Katrina and in northern Uganda. Since the Newtown tragedy, he has launched a series of resilience building efforts there. He's medical director of Synergy Health in Newtown, where he specializes in brain health, treatment-resistant depression, and resilience. Today, we're going to start off with playing the long healing prayer.
The Long Healing Prayer. He is the healer, the sufficer, the helper, the all-forgiving, the all-merciful. I call on thee, O Exalted One, O Faithful One, O Glorious One, thou the sufficing, thou the healing, thou the abiding, O thou abiding one. I call on thee, O Sovereign, O Upraiser, O Judge, thou the sufficing, thou the healing, thou the abiding, O thou abiding one. I call on thee, O Peerless One, O Eternal One, O Single One, thou the sufficing, thou the healing, thou the abiding, O thou abiding one. I call on thee, O Most Praised One, O Holy One, O Helping One, thou the sufficing, thou the healing, thou the abiding, O thou abiding one. I call on thee, O Omniscient, O Most Wise, O Most Great One, thou the sufficing, thou the healing, thou the abiding, O thou abiding one. I call on thee, O Clement One, O Majestic One, O Ordaining One, thou the sufficing, thou the healing, thou the abiding, O thou abiding one. I call on thee, O Beloved One, O Cherished One, O Enraptured One, thou the sufficing, thou the healing, thou the abiding, O thou abiding one. I call on thee, O Mightiest One, O Sustaining One, O Potent One, thou the sufficing, thou the healing, thou the abiding, O thou abiding one. I call on thee, O Ruling One, O Self-subsisting, O All-knowing One, thou the sufficing, thou the healing, thou the abiding, O thou abiding one. I call on thee, O Spirit, O Light, O Most Manifest One, thou the sufficing, thou the healing, thou the abiding, O thou abiding one. I call on thee, O thou frequented by all, O thou known to all, O thou hidden from all, thou the sufficing, thou the healing, thou the abiding, O thou abiding one. I call on thee, O Concealed One, O Triumphant One, O Bestowing One, thou the sufficing, thou the healing, thou the abiding, O thou abiding one. I call on thee, O Almighty, O Succoring One, O Concealing One, thou the sufficing, thou the healing, thou the abiding, O thou abiding one. I call on thee, O Fashioner, O Satisfier, O Uprooter, thou the sufficing, thou the healing, thou the abiding, O thou abiding one. I call on thee, O rising one, O gathering one, O exalting one, thou the sufficing, thou the healing, thou the abiding, O thou abiding one. I call on thee, O perfecting one, O unfettered one, O bountiful one, thou the sufficing, thou the healing, thou the abiding, O thou abiding one. I call on thee, O beneficent one, O withholding one, O creating one, thou the sufficing, thou the healing, thou the abiding, O thou abiding one. I call on thee, O most sublime one, O beauteous one, O bounteous one, thou the sufficing, thou the healing, thou the abiding, O thou abiding one. I call on thee, O just one, O gracious one, O generous one, thou the sufficing, thou the healing, thou the abiding, O thou abiding one. I call on thee, O all-compelling, O ever-abiding, O most knowing one, thou the sufficing, thou the healing, thou the abiding, O thou abiding one. I call on thee, O magnificent one, O ancient of days, O magnanimous one, thou the sufficing, thou the healing, thou the abiding, O thou abiding one. I call on thee, O well-guarded one, O Lord of joy, O desired one, thou the sufficing, thou the healing, thou the abiding, O thou abiding one. I call on thee, O thou kind to all, O thou compassionate withal, O most benevolent one, thou the sufficing, thou the healing, thou the abiding, O thou abiding one. I call on thee, O haven for all, O shelter to all, O all-preserving one, thou the sufficing, thou the healing, thou the abiding, O thou abiding one. I call on thee, O thou succorer of all, O thou invoked by all, O quickening one, thou the sufficing, thou the healing, thou the abiding, O thou abiding one. I call on thee, O unfolder, O ravager, O most clement one, thou the sufficing, thou the healing, thou the abiding, O thou abiding one. I call on thee, O thou my soul, O thou my beloved, O thou my faith, thou the sufficing, thou the healing, thou the abiding, O thou abiding one. I call on thee, O quencher of thirsts, O transcendent Lord, O most precious one, thou the sufficing, thou the healing, thou the abiding, O thou abiding one. I call on thee, O greatest remembrance, O noblest name, O most ancient way, thou the sufficing, thou the healing, thou the abiding, O thou abiding one. I call on thee, O most lauded, O most holy, O sanctified one, thou the sufficing, thou the healing, thou the abiding, O thou abiding one. I call on thee, O unfastener, O counselor, O deliverer, thou the sufficing, thou the healing, thou the abiding, O thou abiding one. I call on thee, O friend, O physician, O captivating one, thou the sufficing, thou the healing, thou the abiding, O thou abiding one. I call on thee, O glory, O beauty, O bountiful one, thou the sufficing, thou the healing, thou the abiding, O thou abiding one. I call on thee, O the most trusted, O the best lover, O Lord of the dawn, thou the sufficing, thou the healing, thou the abiding, O thou abiding one. I call on thee, O enkindler, O brightener, O bringer of delight, thou the sufficing, thou the healing, thou the abiding, O thou abiding one. I call on thee, O Lord of bounty, O most compassionate, O most merciful one, thou the sufficing, thou the healing, thou the abiding, O thou abiding one. I call on thee, O constant one, O life-giving one, O source of all being, thou the sufficing, thou the healing, thou the abiding, O thou abiding one. I call on thee, O thou who penetratest all things, O all-seeing God, O Lord of utterance, thou the sufficing, thou the healing, thou the abiding, O thou abiding one. I call on thee, O manifest yet hidden, O unseen yet renowned, O onlooker sought by all, thou the sufficing, thou the healing, thou the abiding, O thou abiding one. I call on thee, O thou who slayest the lovers, O God of grace to the wicked, O sufficer, I call on thee, O sufficer, O healer, I call on thee, O healer, O abider, I call on thee, O abider, thou the ever-abiding, O thou abiding one. Sanctified art thou, O my God. I beseech thee by thy generosity, whereby the portals of thy bounty and grace were opened wide, whereby the temple of thy holiness was established upon the throne of eternity, and by thy mercy, whereby thou didst invite all created things unto the table of thy bounties and bestowals, and by thy grace, whereby thou didst respond, in thine own self, with thy word, yea, on behalf of all in heaven and earth, at the hour when thy sovereignty and thy grandeur stood revealed, at the dawn time when the might of thy dominion was made manifest. And again do I beseech thee, by these most beauteous names, by these most noble and sublime attributes, and by thy most exalted remembrance, and by thy pure and spotless beauty, and by thy hidden light in the most hidden pavilion, and by thy name cloaked with the garment of affliction every morn and eve, to protect the bearer of this blessed tablet, and whoso reciteth it, and whoso cometh upon it, and whoso passeth around the house wherein it is. Heal thou then by it every sick, diseased and poor one, from every tribulation and distress, from every loathsome affliction and sorrow, and guide thou by it whosoever desireth to enter upon the paths of thy guidance and the ways of thy forgiveness and grace. Thou art verily the powerful, the all-sufficing, the healing, the protector, the giving, the compassionate, the all-generous, the all-merciful. Baha'u'llah.
Uh, Thank you, everyone, and thank you for this wonderful opportunity. I think I should start right off by saying that the long healing prayer of Baha'u'llah is a vast ocean, and it would be impossible to cover even a wave of that ocean in the time we have today. So I'll use this time as best I can to try to say something that perhaps hasn't been said before. And also to refer you to some wonderful reflections by some others and some beautiful, beautiful renditions of the prayer also. So if I could just give some resources. One is an absolutely beautiful chanted version of the original Arabic by Sima Jabiri. Its advantages, it's in the original Arabic and it's in the entirety. The second is a wonderful rendition that the Utterance Project put out that's also in Arabic, but it has the advantage, it's not chanted, but it has the advantage of providing an English translation and the Arabic transliteration. So it's a wonderful resource. Third is a very scholarly and erudite presentation by Daniel Pschaida, I believe is his last name, Pschaida, who did a wonderful presentation on the long healing prayer through the Wilmette Institute. All of these resources and many others are on a Facebook page called The Long Healing Prayer. So if you'd like to join that group, you're very welcome. And I believe this presentation will wind up on that site also. I'm not quite sure exactly who the audience is, but I understand there may be some people who are still new to the Baha'i faith. That being the case, please be sure to stop me or to say if I'm talking about things that are too unfamiliar. But again, this ocean is vast of Baha'u'llah's revelation. And certainly this prayer in particular, for me, this prayer is a proof of Baha'u'llah's revelation all by itself. It holds some of the most central principles of Baha'u'llah's teachings, and the teachings of all religions are contained in this immensely powerful prayer. What I would like to ask you to do is if you have a Baha'i prayer book, go to the long healing prayer right now and have it available as we go through this, so that I can refer to it and you have the prayer right there that you can refer to in your own prayer book. I want to begin with a statement of Baha'u'llah that appears in a book called Gleanings from the Writings of Baha'u'llah. I don't know if you can see that. Well, at any rate, it's called Gleanings from the Writings of Baha'u'llah on page 8, where Baha'u'llah says, "The whole duty of man in this day is to attain that share of the flood of grace which God poureth forth for him." I'm going to read that again. The whole duty of man in this day is to attain that share of the flood of grace which God poureth forth for him. It's a wonderful and tantalizing quote from Baha'u'llah, who's speaking on behalf of God and saying that there are these immense gifts that God wants to pour out to us. And our job is to open up our hearts and minds to receive, right? To receive this grace. And this prayer, I think, is really a wonderful pathway to help us receive the outpourings of God's grace. Now, having said that, the original prayer of Baha'u'llah was revealed in Arabic. The translators had an impossible task of trying to render into English Baha'u'llah's incomparable command of Arabic. Now, Arabic is a very subtle and complex language where the root of every word can have multiple meanings. So with the selection of a single word, Baha'u'llah might be unfolding many, many meanings that the English equivalent doesn't carry those same meanings. So we're really at a disadvantage as not being Arabic speakers in approaching this text, because the original is a roiling ocean of meaning and depth and transformative power. Just a stylistic example of that is in English, we have in the triplets, the verses that begin, I call on thee, O exalted one, O faithful one, O glorious one. In the original Arabic, every one of those words has the prefix bikaya. I call on thee, I call on thee, I call on thee. So there are 3 I call on these in the original Arabic, where in English there's only 1. So this is just one stylistic example of meanings and rhythms and cadences of the original that are lost in the translation. I wouldn't want to have to be the translator trying to do this, what I think is an impossible task, rendering Baha'u'llah's matchless utterances into English. But that said, we still have a profoundly wonderful translation to work from. So I'd like to actually begin with the end of the prayer. If you happen to have a prayer book, a Baha'i prayer book, I'd actually like to go to the end, the very, very end of the prayer, and read what Baha'u'llah says is the purpose of the prayer, what its end result would be. And I'm going to read the last phrases of the last sentence. Then we'll go and we'll read this whole last paragraph to get an idea of what the prayer is about. Well, we're going to begin with the end. And Baha'u'llah says, after explaining to us what powers were beseeching in this prayer, he says that the reason we're saying this prayer is, and we're asking God to, 1, protect the bearer of this blessed tablet, and whoso reciteth it, and whoso cometh upon it, and whoso passeth around the house wherein it is. It's giving a sense of its power. And then he says, the second thing is, heal thou then by it every sick, diseased, and poor one, from every tribulation and distress, from every loathsome affliction and sorrow. And then the third thing, and guide thou by it whosoever desireth to enter upon the paths of thy guidance. Fourth, and the ways of thy forgiveness and grace. Now, the reason I wanted to highlight this is to talk about these qualities that Baha'u'llah relates to the powers of this prayer, what this prayer unleashes for our healing. He equates the word protection with healing, right? What does he mean by protection? He equates the word guidance with healing. What does he mean by guidance? He equates the word forgiveness with healing. What does he mean by forgiveness? And he relates the word grace to healing. What does he mean by grace? Right. So I wanted to begin with a quick explication of those 4 terms in Baha'u'llah's writings. And the first is to talk about the word guidance. Guide thou then by it. Oh, no, I'm sorry, I'm going to go to protect first. I skipped ahead in my notes. And on page 120 of another book of Baha'u'llah's called Prayers and Meditations, which is a compilation of Baha'u'llah's prayers in one place. There are many places where Baha'u'llah refers to protection, not only as physical protection, so that our physical well-being is maintained. In fact, mostly when Baha'u'llah is speaking of protection, he's talking about something else. He says, shield them, meaning those who believe in God, by thy name the preserver, within the stronghold of thy might and power, that happily they may be protected from the darts of doubt that are hurled by such as have rebelled against thee. That, we live in such a chaotic time, such a really, all you have to do is watch the news for 3 minutes, and it would be quite easy to become terrified about the conditions of the world. And this fear, this sense of lack of control over what's going on in the world does cause us to feel frightened and powerless. What Baha'u'llah is saying is that what that sense of fear and powerlessness can evoke in us is a lack of confidence in his power to protect us. Right? So what the first thing Baha'u'llah means in this prayer, in the recitation of this prayer, is that we come to have an assurance of God's protection, that he is sufficient to care for our needs and to care for our soul, to care for the divine trust that's within us, that we can rest assured in our protection from doubt. Right? So that's the first important point that we'll come back to. And he relates the sense of protection, this idea that we can be freed from doubt, that and assured that God is protecting us, that our welfare is in his hands and that he intends the best for us. He equates that with healing, right? This sense of assurance, this sense of knowing that God is sufficing and that he desires to help us, that this is equated with healing. So that notion of protection, right? So again, as we are freed from doubt and we are protected by his providence, we are healed, we are guided, we are forgiven, and we receive grace. Okay. So this notion of guidance is the second concept Baha'u'llah refers to in the last phrases of this prayer about its purpose. Now, there's a fascinating set of references in the Baha'i writings to this idea of guidance, which I think we kind of pass over pretty quickly. We think of it kind of in literal terms. Well, we have all these writings and these teachings that are guidance, but I think he means it on another level about how can we feel and experience the sense of being internally guided once we have that sense of assurance in God's protection. Now, in another very, very, very critically important set of documents called the Tablets of the Divine Plan, that Abdu'l-Baha, Baha'u'llah's son, revealed in 1915 and 16 during the middle of the First World War. He wrote to different sections of the United States about the spiritual mission that these various parts of the country and Canada had in unfolding a peace on the planet. It's a fascinating document. And in the section that Baha'u'llah revealed for the northeastern states, he talks about this idea of guidance multiple times. And I'll just refer to a few of them. But he's speaking about how an illumined soul, that the Baha'is need to become illumined, and that to combine that state of being illumined with the divine teachings, and that when that happens, they can be a source of guidance to others and to themselves. He says, the grace of guidance is like unto the candle, which is kindled in the glass of knowledge and wisdom. And that glass of knowledge and wisdom is the mirror of the heart of humanity. Now, again, in the prayer for the New England states, Abdu'l-Baha refers 3 times to the purpose of the prayer. The purpose of our spiritual life is to attain the station of guidance. Isn't that interesting? So, and again, by it, he means that we find the way to purify the gems of our inner being through a pure heart and a pure mind. We purify the mirror of our soul so that the light of divine guidance, the light of revelation can shine in it. And Abdu'l-Baha then says that this is then light upon light, right? The purity of the heart reflected the divine light as a light upon light. And so it's interesting that he talks about guidance, not so much in the context of believe this and believe that, but being in this inner condition. And in the long healing prayer, that inner condition is also associated with healing. So now we have protection and guidance. The next idea is that of forgiveness. Tremendous concept. I had it later in my notes. I think we'll just go to it now. The Bab, who is the precursor of Baha'u'llah, the manifestation of God who in himself embodied what the Guardian talks about, 25 of the 27 letters of knowledge that had been revealed by God. The Bab, who is the king of the messengers. The Bab in his writings refers to the idea of sin as being the condition of being anything but God. So it doesn't have the connotation of condemnation or failure. It's just simply that the entire creation is in a state of dependence and receiving from the Creator, right? And he calls that condition sin. In the Bible, you might remember a verse that says, "All fall short of the glory of God." So in this sense, forgiveness is simply recognition of our dependent state and turning to God and beseeching a connection with Him, so that the divine within us can be mirrored forth. So I want to, before we go to the grace part of this, of that last statement, go back to that last paragraph. And I'd like to read the whole thing for you now and talk about how most of this prayer is about an unfolding of the understanding of the station of the manifestation of God and our relationship to the manifestation. So here the Baha'u'llah begins by stating a version of what I just tried to allude to in the writings of the Bab. He says, "Sanctified art thou, O my God." So we begin with this notion that God is beyond human understanding, beyond the creation, above and transcendent from his creation. And then we beseech God, "I beseech thee by thy generosity, whereby the portals of thy bounty and grace were open wide." Whereby, and so it's because of God's grace and his generosity that opens up the portals of bounty and grace. So here's the interesting thing, and we'll talk about, well, I'll just read the rest and explain what it means as we go. He says, as a result of his generosity that reveals his bounty and grace, God chose to create the universe. And just like it says in the Bible, in the beginning was the Word. So what does God do as he decides to create creation? He creates the temple of holiness, which is what the next line says. This is a way of saying God establishes the manifestation of God. He creates the manifestation of God as the vehicle for creation. So whereby through thy bounty and grace were open wide, whereby the temple of thy holiness was established upon the throne of eternity. The temple of thy holiness, it refers to the manifestation of God that creates creation. So the prayer is beseeching God by the manifestation, the power that generates the universe. And then he says, and by thy mercy, whereby thou didst invite all created things unto the table of thy bounties and bestowals. Now, this is an interesting concept, because if you think of the way sin is understood in other theologies, so let's say Christian theology, that there's some kind of terrible mark on the human soul that needs to be erased. This isn't the Baha'i concept of sin. The Baha'i notion of sin is that we are all creation of the Creator and in need of the bestowals of the Creator. And that is what sin is. It's not that it's some kind of deficit. It's not that it's a willful deficit. It's that it's our nature to be powerless and to be in dependent need on the Creator. Right? So in the Quran, in the first verse of the Quran, it says, in the name of God, the merciful, the compassionate. You know, in my work as a psychiatrist, the suffering of the world, the traumas that people experience, it can cause us to feel that somehow we're broken, or that we're unworthy, or that somehow the river of life is flowing, but it's not for us, that we are deficient in some way and outside of the grace and acceptance of God, and that all these nice ideas are for someone else, but not for us, that because of some failure, some lack of understanding or who we are, that we are not worthy of God. But what the Quran is telling us in its first verse, in the name of God, the merciful, the compassionate, that what underlies creation is not God's judgment and not his vengeance and not his justice, but his mercy. And so the mercy and compassion of God is what generates the universe. There's a saying in Islam, the mercy of God precedes his justice. And what that means is that God chooses to express his mercy over all other qualities so that the creation can exist, right? So in this verse, we're seeing that notion of God's mercy is what generates creation. And then he makes this profound statement, and by thy grace, whereby thou didst respond in thine own self with thy word, yea, on behalf of all in heaven and earth. That sounds like a very obscure comment, but what it means is, my understanding is that when God creates the word of God, the manifestation of God, that is embodied in the founders of the world's great religions, they stand as a mirror to God's Son, right? The Son of God's, the S-U-N, of the splendor of God. And they reflect back to God his splendor. And in essence, they're speaking on behalf of creation. And there's another statement in the Quran where God says, am I not your Lord? And the faithful and the prophets of God respond, yea, verily. So the prophets of God, the manifestations of God, answer on behalf of all creation and say, yes. When God says, am I not your Lord? They answer on behalf of us, yes, you are the Lord. And then, like it says in the long obligatory prayer, then we as humanity then say, here am I, here am I. We respond by then with the fullness of our being, that we acknowledge that same thing. So the prayer here is acknowledging our relationship with the Creator, whose generosity and mercy generate creation, through the vehicle of the manifestation of God who answers for us, and that we then acknowledge and testify to that. Now, and then he talks about how at the hour when thy sovereignty and thy grandeur stood revealed, at the dawn time when the might of thy dominion was made manifest. I think these refer to this day, how the divine springtime has come, and that God has manifested again, just as he did with the appearance of Jesus and Muhammad and Buddha and Krishna and Muhammad and Moses and Abraham. Yet again, with the Bab and Baha'u'llah, he's manifested. And he says now, he speaks specifically now about what might be thought of as 4 manifestations. Now this is me, but I'd be interested in your understanding. So here we've gone through this kind of divine theophany of the sovereign nature of God, and how he generates creation through the word of God, the temple of holiness, the Haikal, the temple of holiness, and that how the manifestation answers on behalf of creation to the Creator, saying yea. And he announces the day of God. And now he talks of how this prayer is beseeching God by what looks like 4 manifestations. He says, and again do I beseech thee by these most beauteous names, which we just heard in the prayer, and by these most noble and sublime attributes. Now here come the 4 names. And by thy most exalted remembrance. Now the most exalted remembrance in Baha'i terminology seems to be a reference to the Bab, right? And then by thy pure and spotless beauty. Now one would think that might be Baha'u'llah, but let's keep reading. And by thy hidden light in the most hidden pavilion. Well, that's capital L light. That's we're referring to a manifestation. Who is that? My take is it's probably a prophecy for the next manifestation. And by thy name, cloaked with the garment of affliction every morn and eve. I think that's more clearly Baha'u'llah. I wonder if this prayer has the Bab and Baha'u'llah as the first and last references, and two more manifestations referred to between them. That the Bab is referred to as the most exalted remembrance. The pure and spotless beauty might be another manifestation, and the hidden light in the most hidden pavilion, and then thy name cloaked with the garment of affliction every morning and eve being Baha'u'llah. It's just speculation on my part, but there are references to 4 names of God. 2 of them are clearly the Bab and Baha'u'llah, but who are the other 2? Are they references to versions of the Bab and Baha'u'llah? Or is this an example of the unity of God, how all the manifestations of God are really the same, they are the same faithful spirit, which we'll refer to in a few minutes. So I wanted to begin with that to show how the prayer centers on an explication of the station of the manifestation of God, and how we as human beings, as the creation, are really mirrors of the primary mirrors, right? We are the primary mirrors being the manifestations of God, the Christ spirit, the most great spirit, the faithful spirit, the spirit of manifestation, the ancient of days that appears from time to time throughout history, that we as humans are we can potentially mirror all of the qualities of the Creator through the guidance and inspiration of the manifestation. Right. So having said that, notice too how Baha'u'llah refers to the manifestations of God as the temple of thy holiness, the temple. The word for that in Arabic is haikal. Now we're going to go to the beginning of the prayer, right? And we're going to show or explore how this notion of the temple, or the manifestation of God, is played out, and our relationship to the temple, the manifestation of God, is played out through the prayer. The prayer begins with 5, the recitation of 5 of the names of God. And this is me just speculating, but to me that's not an accident. The number 5 in Abjad notation is significant of the Bab. Just like in Hebrew, where every letter of the alphabet has a numerical value, so that when you write a word, you're also writing a number. It's same in Arabic also, that when you write a word, you're also writing a letter. When you write the name the Bab or Bab, the B is a 2, the A is a 1, and the B is another 2, so that adds to 5. So the number 5 is associated with the manifestation of God, right? So the manifestation of God is called upon in the very first recitation of 5 names. He is the healer, the sufficer, the helper, the all-forgiving, the all-merciful. And if we were to even like draw a pentagram, you could think of the purpose of the prayer is to understand God as the healer. So that's like the top pinnacle of this 5-pointed star. And the base of the star, the first base, is the notion that he's the sufficer, that above all of our fears, beyond all of our doubts, beyond all of our anxieties, about our safety and about the state of our soul, that he is the sufficer and he is the all-sufficing, that there is a sure and abiding presence of God's sufficing help to be the healer and to be the helper, which is the next name, through the power of his might, through the hand of his, symbolic reference. If you looked at the star as the symbol of like a person, you know, the outstretched hands represent the power of that individual. So the power of the manifestation then is as the helper. He chooses to be the healer through his sufficing grace, and he chooses to be the helper. Right? So he's not the condemning, vindictive, just avenger. He's the helper. And we can turn to him as the helper. And then the forgiving. that now that we've set up this relationship between ourselves and the all-sufficing, forgiving, or all-sufficing helper and healer, that is what forgiveness is, right? Forgiveness is, God wants to bestow forgiveness. He wants us to be freed from the burdens of our actions and be drawn close to him. So this is the first expression of the word forgiving, which Baha'u'llah then says at the end of the prayer is one of the purposes of the prayer, so that we can attain to healing. And again, this all-important notion of God being the all-merciful, not the vengeful, not the vindictive, not the punishing, the merciful. So before we've even begun the prayer, these 5 names of God have already established the context for our healing. Right? And just meditation on these 5 names is a powerful cleansing force. So now, having talked about the Hakal, let's talk about what the main structural feature of the prayer, which is a recitation 39 times of a triplet, 3 names of God, followed by a constant verse. Now, I want to talk about that constant repeating verse first. And if we just take the example of the first verse, he says, I call on the O exalted one, O faithful one, O glorious one. We'll talk about that triad in just a minute. And then we have the first recitation of this constant verse, thou the sufficing, thou the healing, thou the abiding, O thou abiding one. I want to talk about that verse that repeats. We have 3 times in which we testify to something, right? I am recognizing that you are sufficing over all my fears, over all my doubts, over all my uncertainties and powerlessness. You are sufficing. And you, therefore, are the healing. And I can abide, and you abide that way. You are unchanging in that way. You're not the sufficing and healing some of the time. You're that way all of the time. Always have been, eternally have been, and eternally will. So we're testifying to this over and over again. And I think it's done in that repetitive way to help it sink in deeper. Now, it's interesting. We testify 3 times, and then we beseech. It's almost like we're lifted up in gratitude. And we're not testifying that you're these things. We've already said it. Now we're saying, oh, thou abiding one. Oh, it's a reaching back to God in gratitude. So thou the sufficing. I not acknowledge you are sufficing. You are healing. You are abiding. Oh, what a comfort that is. I'm so grateful. Oh, thou abiding one. So I think it's a lovely, lovely repeated supplication over and over that reinforces in us that sense of, again, his being the sufficing, the healing, and the abiding. Now, the triplet of names that appears above each repetition of this key phrase, I think could be looked at a number of ways. One is that the triplet of names that occurs above this constant verse are aspects of the sufficing nature of God. They're aspects of the healing nature of God. They're aspects of the abiding nature of God that are healing, sufficing, and abiding. So we get a sense of the dynamic power of how God is the sufficing, how he is the healer, how he is the abiding. And within that, we're also learning something about how God guides us, how God forgives us, how God heals us, and how God's grace is dispensed to us, as the prayer promises in the last paragraph. So let's talk just a little bit about that opening phrase. And I think this is another testament to how the prayer is about the manifestations of God, because it begins with a calling on the 2 manifestations of God for this day, the exalted one, the blessed Bab, and the glorious one, which is the blessed beauty, the Baha'u'llah. So the prayer begins with calling on the ultimate manifestations of God for history, all of history. And they're united by another name, the faithful one. Now, this is fascinating. The faithful one is referred to in Baha'i writings. The meaning of the faithful one is given a couple meanings. The primary one is the faithful spirit, meaning the spirit of God that manifests, the word of God that appears from age to age. And not only that, but the faithful spirit is the spirit of revelation. And so it's the spirit that generates all things through the word of God, right? So God, in the Kitab Yagan, Baha'u'llah says God reveals himself to himself, which is something we have no idea what that means, right? But then God also manifests himself to the word, right? And that creates creation, right? And that process of God revealing himself to the manifestation and generating creation from moment to moment, that's called the divine springtime in one set of references of Baha'u'llah. But it's also called the faithful spirit, that without that revelation, creation would cease to exist. Right? And that specifically to the human mind, to the pinnacle of creation, that revelation then is given voice through revelation, through the word of God, through what we know as words of God established in tablets, manifested in being, whether it's Jesus or Muhammad or Buddha or Krishna or Jesus or Muhammad or Baha'u'llah or the Ba. So this opening verse begins with that covenant that God was ever always sufficing, always present, always generating grace, always providing us a sufficient and abiding grace to generate us and all of creation, and that we are always a part of that. No act of ours, no denial on our part, no doubt on our part can separate us from the reality of our being a part of God's grace. So our turning to God is really not so much of coming into a belief system as it is uncovering the covenant within us, that this calling that God has on our souls, that we are always his lovers, and that we just simply need to be aware of that and turn towards that. And that is what is healing. So in the very first verse, we're called to that understanding. Now, going through 39 of these would take a whole lot more. What I wanted to do is just talk about a couple of the dynamics of how these triplets seem to be organized, that as you meditate on this prayer, as you let it stir you, you might call to mind a certain dynamics that Baha'u'llah seems to be unfolding in the relationship of these names together. There's a tradition in Islam that creation is generated by the interaction of at least two names of God, that one name of God and another name of God in juxtaposition generates another form of creation, and that it's the complexity and the interactions between these names of God that generates the infinite diversity of creation. So let's just think about that for just a second, and I'll give just a couple examples, and then we'll start wrapping up and we can have a conversation. But one of the types of interactions of these names is the opposition of, or the juxtaposition of opposite names. And from those opposites, a third thing is generated. And these then become ways to think about the sufficing, healing, and abiding grace of God. So for instance, in the middle of the prayer, Baha'u'llah says, I call on thee, O beneficent one. And of course, beneficent means ever giving, always willing to give generously, right? That's the beneficent one. But then it says, O withholding one. That's the opposite of being beneficent. You know, I'm looking for God's grace, and I'm a dry desert, right? I'm looking for God's guidance, and I haven't got a clue. I would love to love God, but I feel absolutely bereft. right? So we have these opposites that Baha'u'llah then says, oh benevolent one, oh withholding one, oh creating one. Now, in the Lawi Hekmat, Baha'u'llah talks about how creation is generated through the opposite forces of an active and a passive force. And he says that these forces are the same, yet they're different. So it's something that's the recipient at one time is the giver at another time. And so these opposites are generating creation all the time. And we can have a whole discussion about quantum physics at some point about that. That'd be fascinating. But here Baha'u'llah is making that point. Here's the beneficent one and the withholding one. And from that, these opposites, creation is generated. Well, that's an interesting concept when we're thinking about our suffering, when we're thinking about why is this desert in my soul so dry? Why is this time in my life so painful? Why is this lack of insight so grinding on my mind and heart, right? So that's the withholding part, but it's the passion for God, right? And having had tasted of his benevolence that drives us through, and we keep moving in that process through that dry desert. And it's because we've had a taste of the beneficence of God that we keep moving despite the dryness. And out of it comes a creative spark. Something new happens, something is stirred in us, something we never would have imagined shows itself. And now we have eyes to perceive it, where before we didn't. So this notion of movement through through opposition of different opposite qualities is key to many of the Baha'i writings, right? Where we see these opposite qualities have to be balanced. And it's interesting that all of this is placed in the context of healing and forgiveness and protection and guidance and grace. These are the words Baha'u'llah uses. Let's use another example. I love this one. It's on the same page, right at the bottom of the same page. If you have this old prayer book, it's page 105. Baha'u'llah says, I call on thee, O well-guarded one. And boy, I know that one. It's a where is God? Right? Where is God? Right? I'm just dying to find God. And he's well guarded. He is not making himself available, right? Or I see this vast infinite universe and I'm starstruck by its wonder and think, yeah, but this is just a thimbleful from this vast ocean. And where is God? He is well guarded. And it says, I call on thee, O well guarded one. And look what the next one says. O Lord of joy, O Lord of joy, Lord of joy. Holy cow. So this notion of being just filled with joy from someone who's well guarded, right? So, and then look what that generates. O desired one. This, I think, is fascinating. I've tasted this joy. We were sort of talking about this before, from a source that's completely hidden from me. And what it generates is yearning, desire. I want more of that. And I know I'm going to keep looking. I'm going to be majnun, looking for more of that joy. Where the heck do I find it? Right? And I'm going to look everywhere, under every rock and under every, everything, right? So he's talking about this path of unfoldment, which is riddled with uncertainty, riddled with doubt, riddled with distance and feeling distant and remote, and that's core to the process. So feeding the sense of joy, I think, is a key part of that, because that makes us want to pursue the desired one. Now, as a psychiatrist, this comes in handy when we're talking about anxiety, which I think the whole world, especially in this country, kids in particular, just riddled with anxiety. What if that anxiety in part was yearning for the divine and not knowing where to place it? Well, it was a sense of, where do I find that joy? Where do I find, there's this hidden they're caught up in the hidden nature of the universe, and they're filled with the passionate yearning that kids have for love and joy, and it's driving them, but they don't know where to go. So because it's not directed and not guided, it shows up as anxiety. And so what if we just simply normalized the struggle and said, well, yeah, that's good that you're yearning. It's really, really good. Right? So let's get rid of the static on that, and let's focus that yearning towards the infinite, to unfolding what's in you, towards this divine purpose, where you come to see the sufficing nature of God, the healing nature, the abiding nature, and there's really nothing to be afraid of, nothing to be afraid of. So let's see. Now what a concept in a time when the world is really shaking apart, when the forces of darkness are really crumbling the earth around us. All we have to do is open our phones. Right? It's everywhere. It's everywhere. And how frightening that is, unless you have a sense of, an abiding sense of God's sufficing nature, that he wants to be your all-sufficing provider and healer. So there's probably no greater political act that one could perform right now than to ground one's soul in the abiding grace of God, so that one doesn't become reactive with fear and isn't responding to the troubles of our time with fear or anger or doubt or apathy and despair, but with a sense of an abiding serenity. It's really, really, so I think this prayer is hugely important, if maybe even for political purposes or social purposes, certainly. So, all right, now there are so many other things to cover. I wanted to talk about, let's see here. Before that last paragraph where that we talked about, where it starts with sanctified art thou, Baha'u'llah completes the set of triplets by calling on God the manifest yet hidden, right? He's talking about these opposites. Again, the generating, and think of the power of the manifestation of God, calling on God as the manifest and hidden, the seen and the unseen and the renowned, the onlooker sought by all. Oh, before I do that, that really does remind me, I do want to show you one more thing, and we'll come back. It's just, I think it's so sweet. Where is it? And where Baha'u'llah says he's the enraptured one. Well, God isn't the enraptured one. Right? Baha'u'llah is the enraptured one. I'm sorry, I kind of skipped off my notes a little bit there, but just to point out that along with this juxtaposition of opposite divine qualities generating a third, that then is something that can guide us in our emotional, mental, spiritual growth. There's also a juxtaposition of these names as representing the Godhead being embodied in Baha'u'llah and things that can be manifested in us. So all of them being a part of the manifestation of God. So, O thou my soul, O thou my beloved, O thou my faith, right? So here, it's a great example of how all these names are caught up in God, Baha'u'llah, and me, or our soul, all at the same time. O thou my soul, capital S, so it's Baha'u'llah, but it's also me. O thou my beloved, capital B, it's Baha'u'llah, representing God, but it's also me. O thou my faith, capital F. Well, God's not faith, God is beyond faith, right? But Baha'u'llah represents the faithful spirit, and that can be manifest in me. So we have this, another way that the prayer uses these triplets is to show a dynamic interplay between the manifestation as the vicegerent of God, as the mirror of God in our souls, right? So we see that notion of the oneness of God. And for the life of me, I'm going to try to find that one where he says he's the maybe someone else will find it. Well, okay, not to waste time, but the one where he says that he's the enraptured one. Right? God is enrapturing, right? So the manifestation is enraptured in relation to God, and then we are enraptured in relation to the manifestation. So again, it's this, another dynamic of how these triplets play out, how God is the sufficing, the healing, the abiding. So let's go to that, this interesting set of phrases. He says, I call on thee, O thou who slayest the lovers, O God of grace to the wicked. This is the entire theophany in one sentence. Abdu'l-Baha says that the purpose of the Passion of Jesus, which by the way we're commemorating right now, isn't so much that some miraculous thing happened with his being crucified, but it's the resignation, it's the willingness to endure anything out of love of God. That example of absolute pure surrender to the will of God generates infinite creation. Right? And that example and the power released from that is what saves us through grace. So all of the manifestations of God have been slain in one form or another. Baha'u'llah spending 40 years in prison and in exile, beaten, poisoned, forced to run 10 miles in the blistering heat with no shoes and nothing on his head, put in chains in the filthiest dungeon in the Persian Empire for 4 months, scourged, exiled repeatedly, and poisoned and betrayed repeatedly. The over 40 years time. Now it's interesting that in our lives now, the last I checked, and this was 10 years ago, 1 in 60 human beings alive, 1 in 60 people alive in the world right now are refugees. Baha'u'llah was the exile of the world. So we're living the archetypal example of Baha'u'llah now in history. But we have his example of surrender and submission and meekness and joy and powerful endurance and demonstration of God as the sufficing. And the Siyachal, God is sufficient unto me, he verily is the all-sufficing, in him let the trusting trust. So this example that releases this regenerative power is available to us if we seek it. So God slays his lovers to release this regenerative power because he is gracious to everyone. And by the wicked, I think that means all of us, right? It's the translation might be another way of saying the sinful in the way the Bab means it. Everyone, all of creation, sinful in the sense of that we are not close to God and we need help to become close. So God slays the lovers to bring us close to him through his grace. And then he calls on, again, repeats this refrain, O sufficer, I call on thee, O sufficer. But it's with that yearning beseeching. It's not just testifying that he is the sufficing. It's calling on Baha'u'llah, on God. O sufficer, I call on thee, O sufficer. O healer, I call on thee, O healer. O abider, I call on thee, O abider. O thou ever abiding. O thou abiding one. The passionate yearning of that is, I think, what this prayer is all about. And in that is, again, our manifesting that key phrase of the Quran where God says, am I not your Lord? And we respond, yea, O thou abiding one. All right, friends, thank you.
Thank you so much. So it's really interesting. And obviously I hadn't even thought of most of that before. So it's definitely very enlightening. Thank you so much. If anyone has any questions, now we'll have some time so you can put it in the chat. So the first question, is the notion of healing in the Baha'i faith different than its common meaning of getting physically or mentally better?
You know what, I didn't talk about that much, did I? The primary healing is this alignment of our soul with the sufficing, healing, and abiding nature of God, where whatever happens to us, and clearly we want to do what we can to heal, to keep ourselves healthy, but that fear and reaction does not govern our life, but that a conscious engagement with God's sufficing help is what guides us, and is what directs us. So fundamentally, healing is spiritual healing in that sense. And I don't mean spiritual in some magical sense. I mean it in the way I just described it. But that winds up being the focus of physical healing, or a critically important element of physical healing. I have lots of patients who have psychosomatic illnesses, and they're riddled with fear about, this symptom's going to kill them, this particular situation is breaking them. And so without that sense of the sufficing, abiding, healing nature of God, I can give them all the medication in the world and do all the cognitive behavioral therapy in the world, but they're stuck in that fundamental dilemma. And so, and I'm speaking about mental health, but it's true for physical health too, because these kinds of reactions to our suffering, these fearful, anxious reactions to our suffering, compromises our immune system. It increases clotting. It engenders cancer, all sorts of things. So there's an intimate relationship between how our body functions and this sense of abiding grace of God. So they're not separate. Now, in the Baha'i writings, it very emphatically states that we should combine spiritual healing with physical healing. So this spiritual strengthening of our sense of assurance in God's sufficing presence is a foundation upon which we build all of our physical healing. So we need to go to doctors. We need to go to people who know what they're doing and can not just tell us stuff they read off the internet, but like actually have experience and training in healing. My life has been saved by a surgeon. But I think it's also this prayer. So this prayer plus a good surgeon and saved my life. So so healing is both of those things. I'll just two quick stories. There's a man named Mirza Jafar, who I think has been raised from the dead twice. Once with this prayer, where Mirza Jafar was one of the followers of Baha'u'llah, and he accompanied him on all of his exiles. And at Baji, he prepared the tea for the believers. And one morning there was no tea, and everyone was like, "Well, where's Mirza Jafar?" So they found him, and he was dead. He was in his bed. He was very sick, and he died. And so they sent word to Baha'u'llah that Mirza Jafar has died. So Baha'u'llah sent Abdul Baha and said, "Say the prayer Ya Safi," which is this prayer, and Mirza Jafar will be fine. So Abdul Baha went back to Mirza Jafar and said this prayer, and Mirza Jafar got up and started cracking jokes. So, Baha'is don't talk about Baha'u'llah's miracles, but this is Baha'u'llah doing a miracle through Abdul Baha, through this prayer. So there's that. The same Mirza Jafar, this is a little anecdote. The same Mirza Jafar is mentioned in a couple of books that I think it's the same Mirza Jafar. Again, one morning, where's the tea? Where's Mirza Jafar? Everybody's looking for Mirza Jafar. And somebody looks over the balcony at Baji and they see Mirza Jafar in the bushes on the ground, dead. He fell off I don't know how he fell off the balcony, but he fell off the balcony. So they run to Baha'u'llah again and said, "Baha'u'llah, Mirza Jafar." And so Baha'u'llah comes to the side of the balcony and says, "Mirza Jafar, get up. The friends haven't had their tea." And he jumps up and he goes and makes tea. I don't know. So the point being, things like that apparently can happen, but see a doctor too.
Thank you. And to follow up on that, is there objective scientific evidence of the healing prayers having a healing effect?
There's a Bahá'í in Germany who's done some work on fasting and healing, which I think is some preliminary work, which is very fascinating. But no, there's no scientific data yet on it. I think that'd be very, very fascinating. But I think it would take the form of, looking at things like interleukins and prostaglandins and things that mediate inflammation and disease like cancer, and how those might be affected by those who say this prayer. But how do you measure like sincerity in saying the prayer, completing it, and so it's going to be hard to do science on it, but it'll probably happen one day. But I'm looking forward to that date, though. I think it'll be fascinating. I should say, I know people who are supposed to be dead, who the only intervention that was changing that is this prayer. People who listened to this prayer chanted through the night on their deathbeds in a hospital, and the next morning had no illness. I mean, is that a proof? No. Is that something that should be bandied about as some kind of miracle? No. But anecdotally, I know many stories like that.
Thank you. How does the long healing prayer show Baha'u'llah's supremacy in relation to all preceding manifestations?
So, but you have to be careful with language here. Let's go to the Quran again, where it talks about how in that day people will come face to face with God, right? If we look at the way revelation has happened in the past, in the days of Moses, remember Moses went into the wilderness and he saw a flame on the mountain, and he went and he saw a burning bush, remember? And he was given the 10 Commandments. So this is a revelation from God in the form of a vision, some kind of experience that Moses is having with what is at least symbolically referred to as a burning bush. What Baha'u'llah says is that the voice that was in the burning bush is the voice he is revealing with, right? So that humans can now hear, the average human can now read in Baha'u'llah's writings what Moses heard, the same voice. So it's the fullness of the revelation that's different. It's not that the revelation itself is different, but it's that what humanity can receive is different. Where in the days of Moses, it was Moses hearing this voice, putting it in the form of 10 Commandments and handing it to people. In this age, we're hearing the voice itself through Baha'u'llah. So one of the things that I think is a proof in this tablet is the dynamics of unfolding the divine unity. The key theological teaching of the faith is the unfoldment of this idea of a divine unity, which in Christian notions is that, how Christians think that Jesus is God, right? And then Muslims say that Muhammad is a prophet of God, right? But that through him, this revelation occurred. Well, the Baha'i writings unfold the understanding of the manifestation of God and how, in a concept called the divine unity, that the presence of God can never be attained in the sense of the actual essence of God, but that God has revealed himself in creation in signs, that his names and attributes are manifest in the creation. But his names and attributes aren't his essence. Just like the qualities of a painting, the textures and the rhythms of the painting and the complements of the colors and the subject matter all reveal something about the painter. In a similar way, the signs of God are everywhere in the universe, but they're not God. They're the signs of God. But that the path to God is through the manifestation of God, who manifests these names and attributes of God perfectly. What this prayer does, I think probably as well, I don't know a prayer or a writing of Baha'u'llah that as powerfully demonstrates the dynamic interplay between God, the manifestation, and humanity. So in that sense, I think this prayer is a proof of the nearness of God. So in an incomparable way, I don't think there's nothing in the Quran that's similar, that is this direct in putting us in contact with those creative divine powers. So in that sense, I would say it's supreme. But I don't like the idea of, this is just me, I don't like, oh, my prophet's better than your prophet kind of thinking. So I'm not going to go that way. But more that the explication of our relationship to the divine is displayed, and we are engaged in that relationship with God in such a powerful, direct way that I don't know it's like in any other divine writing from any other source.
Thank you. Sin has had connotations in the past that does not seem to be applied in the writings of the Baha'i faith. Can you explain the way it's understood or explained in the Baha'i writings?
Well, again, just in an abbreviated form, it's kind of the way I described it, is that it's not that we're like Adam and Eve sinned, and that because of a sin, there's a mark on our soul that needs to be expunged. It's more that the nature of creation itself is that we are, as the Bible says again, all fall short of the glory of God. There is the glory of God and everything else, right? And everything else is us. It's all the stars in the whole universe. So it's not that we're bad. It's that we are the creation and dependent on the Creator. And so we are, another way that Bob describes that, he says that there is God and all of creation is in a state of prayer, is in a state of dependent calling to God, right? But it's the human soul that can choose to do that consciously, to reveal the full efflorescence of God's qualities, and to a degree that no other part of creation can. So sin is really that primal state that we are all always in need of God's grace. Now, there is also sin in the context of actions that are contrary to our covenant with God, right? Actions that betray our own nature, right? So, so these are things that we then veil ourselves from our own destiny, from our own God-given right of nearness, right? These are things that separate us from that divine relationship, right? So we could call that sin as well. So, what the founders of the great religions, and especially in the Baha'i revelation, there's mapped out in the laws of Baha'u'llah, the ways to protect your soul and the ways to move through this growth process in the most direct way. And that if we violate those laws in some way, yeah, okay, it's bad, but and it can hurt others, absolutely. But really the primary evil of it is that we have deprived ourselves from our nearness to God. And so our forgiveness, the grace of forgiveness and the growth through our faults in that way is reestablishing our connection with our covenant with God. Right? And Christians think that's done through the passion of Jesus and the resurrection of Jesus. Baha'is would say it's every soul's responsibility to find its way to God, and that the grace and forgiveness of God is available to everyone always, and that the word of God expressed through his manifestations is the way to that.
Thank you. Maybe we have time for one more question. This one is, why is the abiding one repeated twice in each verse?
Isn't that wonderful? So I think it's, if you, let's read it. let's take the first verse. I call on thee, O exalted one, O faithful one, O glorious one, thou the sufficing, thou the healing, thou the abiding, O thou abiding one. So it's a different way that we're calling on that name, isn't it? So first we say, thou the abiding. I recognize that you are abiding, that your abiding grace, your sufficing healing grace is always present. It's not just present when I'm aware of it. It's not just present when I need it. It's always present. Right? It always has been, always will be. So I'm acknowledging, O thou abiding one, right? Right. Well, I'm sorry. I'm acknowledging thou the abiding. And because that stirs me with gratitude, because I feel what a gift that he's abiding, thou the abiding. Thank God that you're abiding. And so now I call out to you, God, in a yearning prayer of gratitude and beseeching, O thou abiding one, thou the abiding, O thou abiding one. You are so generous. Oh, thank you so much. Right? And so we do that over and over again throughout the prayer to reestablish the connection. It's God giving to us, and now we're reaching back. Right? And we do it 39 times, well, 40 times in the prayer, right? So love me that I may love thee. If thou lovest me not, my love can in no wise reach thee. So this is us reaching back to God's gifts. Back to and this is a great way to end. Remember that very first thing I read. The whole duty of man in this day is to attain that share of the flood of grace which God poureth forth for him. Right? So the gifts of God, the grace of God is so abundant, it's hard for us to believe that he could be that generous. Right? But what Baha'u'llah is saying and what this prayer is kind of practicing in us, oh thou abiding one, oh thou, is that we're grateful for this outpouring of grace. And we want more of it. And we want to find a way to share it and to make it more manifest in the world for our healing and the healing of the world.
Thank you so much. And with that, we'll wrap it up. Thank you so much again, Dr. Woodall. This was really insightful, and we can all go reflect and read the long healing prayer now with greater insight and depth. So thank you.
No, it's my pleasure. Thanks so much for the opportunity.
Of course. And next week, our speaker will be Dr. Teresa Langness, and her topic will be the Baha'i Faith, a New Vision for Schools. So again, these talks are every Saturday, noon Eastern time, and I've put the link to our contact form in the chat if you're not on our mailing list. And you can also subscribe on YouTube. We're going to post this talk there afterwards. And we'll see you all next week. Bye.
And don't miss next week. It's going to be great.